And we are live. Welcome to Civitasolis Happy Hour. We're very excited to be here today with Dr. Geoffrey Deibel, Assistant Professor of Saxophone at Florida State University and member of the H2 Quartet. Thank you so much, Dr. Deibel, for joining us today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. One logistical note before we get started. Next week, we are going live with a call for scores for Reed Quintet miniatures that incorporate specific contemporary elements or extended techniques. So keep an eye out for that. We will have that up by the end of next week, and make sure to tell all of your composer friends. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, you can write them in the comments of this video, and we will get through them as we go through this live chat. So let's get started. We'd love to start off, Dr. Deibel, by hearing more about your background in chamber music and also about the H2 Quartet.
Uh, Sort of from the beginning, I guess I could tell you about my first, my first forays into chamber music came when I was a high school student. I had a really excellent high school, I should say, teacher in high school. My private lessons teacher, his name is Reginald Jackson, and he's a member of still a member of the Washington Saxophone Quartet, which is the group that you sometimes hear on NPR do the little theme. If you hear saxophone quartet, that's usually them. And so, when I was even a high school student, I was going to see the concert. And we actually ended up forming a group of students that were taking with him, lessons with him. I think maybe one extra student outside of his studio. And yeah, I got some quartet experience early on, and then when I was an undergraduate student at Northwestern, then I was playing quartet basically every year, as sort of part of the curriculum, part of the curriculum there. But my chamber groups changed every year. We reformed groups every year actually, which was kind of at the time I thought it was a little strange, but I think it's good in a way because it teaches you how to work with different kinds of people, and you get a lot of experience playing with different players and get a sense of flexibility, what it means to be flexible as a chamber musician. So that was some of my earlier experiences, and then I took a gap year in between the undergraduate and my master's, and then when I came back for my master's, I played. It was a 1 year master's at Northwestern at that time, which is unheard of nowadays. And so at the time, I met up with a couple of students who were new in the studio, a master's student and a couple of sophomores. And that was kind of one of the first inceptions of what later became H2 Quartet. So we were together for a year, and we're actually fairly successful in some of the competitions. We got into the inaugural Chesapeake Chamber Music Competition, which I'm not sure if that's still going, but we played. We when we went to that, we were sort of out of our element. We were competing against a lot of really excellent groups, but it was a great experience for us. And I believe we also went to the Coleman Chamber Music Competition, which was still around at that time. And yeah, it was an interesting experience. I learned a lot that year about playing in a high powered group and spending lots of time in rehearsal, preparing for concerts and things like that. And then I took another couple of years off in between my master's and my doctoral degree, and I was sort of I could say I was recruited by one of my former H2 quartet um, members up to Michigan State, to sort of get the band back together, if you will, and so that's kind of the current group, which is of course Kim Leffert, Jeff Leffert, and Jonathan Nickel. And yeah, we got that group together starting in 2006, and we've pretty much been going ever since. And that's kind of the basics, I guess.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Do you have any tips for someone creating a chamber group, maybe someone in their undergrad or even master's or doctorate that want to create a chamber group that is successful in competitions and that continues outside of school?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I think on a basic level, you want to play with, obviously you want to play with good musicians, but you also want to play with people that you really enjoy working with. That's pretty important, and it's not like every chamber music group has a different dynamic, so it's not like you have to spend. You're already going to be spending a lot of time together, so you don't have to spend every waking moment together. You can have varying levels of hangout time with the group members. But I think it is important to enjoy working with the people, and usually that sort of goes hand in hand. If you respect them as a musician, most of the time, you're going to enjoy working with them. So I think looking for folks that you're friends with, and that you respect their playing. I think those are two basic criteria. Um, and also I think making sure that the group is on the same page in terms of dedication to time commitments, whether that's rehearsals or competitions or concertizing or sharing the workload when it comes to building websites or whatever it is that you end up doing as a group.
Right, for sure. So not just personalities, but also wanting the same thing for the future of the group as well.
For sure.
So, actually, speaking about logistical responsibilities, obviously there's a lot that goes into the day-to-day logistics of running such a great ensemble. So how do you guys divide those responsibilities up?
Yeah, so I think when we started to think of ourselves more as a professional group, moving from a student ensemble into what was more of a professionally minded group, not just in terms of competitions, but also recording. We made our first CD when we were still students, we were still doctoral students, um, and then eventually we decided that we had to, form a nonprofit organization because there were a lot of grants that we wanted to apply to that were restricted to, nonprofit 501(c)(3)s. So especially once we started doing those more detail-oriented, time-consuming things, as you guys know, filling out grant applications takes a lot of time and effort, and organization. That's when we started to get serious about assigning more specific duties to people. So for a while, I was the grant writer. Jonathan would do a lot of the booking of hotels, and whatever travel things that we needed to work out. Kim was and still is a really great writer, and so she and I would actually share a lot of things like writing liner notes or program notes for concert. Um, and Jeff would do a lot of contacting composers in terms of getting commissions done, other logistical things like that. So yeah, we did some research basically into how do people run professional chamber music organizations, and also how do people run nonprofits, and the ideas about forming boards and all that good stuff. And so we split up duties that way. And then as things evolved, we found sometimes that maybe someone had less time than they thought, and so we'd have to shift duties temporarily to one person or another. Just sort of depended on what was going on in our individual careers and lives. And we also found that some people were really good at some things that maybe they hadn't originally been assigned to. So Jeff Leffert happens to be great at writing proposals, so he started to share some of the grant writing duties and proposal writing with me. So things like that can occur, and that's totally fine. You play to people's strengths when it comes to that sort of thing.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about getting to know each other's personalities. How do you suggest working through any internal issues that arise in rehearsals or in other situations, like when you divvy up responsibilities and have to sort of finagle any issues that arise?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that kind of thing can be sidestepped or kind of avoided, let's say, by making sure that the organization is very clear cut, and that it's very clear what is expected from each member, that everyone's on the same page, and making sure that the communication is really good. And nowadays we have so many different ways to communicate. There's Facebook Messenger, there's text messages, there's email, there's all this stuff, and so occasionally things can get missed, or messages can messages can be distributed, but maybe not to all the group members or something like that, and that can be problematic and can sometimes lead to headaches. So I think making sure that you're really clear about who's doing what's the time frame, when are the deadlines, and that everyone's on the same page as that's concerned. That's super important, can help avoid a lot of headaches in the long run. And then I think when things do arise, because inevitably there's going to be something that happens, or some that's made, or something that gets not done to everyone's satisfaction, or whatever happens to be. I think the hardest thing with this is that you really need to work on understanding that you must take emotion out of whatever it is that is going on, because we're all musicians, as artists, we're all very sensitive people. Our egos are very wrapped up in what we do, for better or for worse. So I think understanding that when it's business, it's just business, and paying attention to the way that you deliver messages and deliver information to each other, trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes in terms of like how that information is received. That's something that we just don't often think about very much, because we think, well, I told them to do this, they should have done that. They didn't do it. What's the big deal? So I think a lot of times, considering other people's feelings and trying to empathize a little bit, when you're communicating is a really good way to deal with any potential pitfalls, problems that might come up when you're trying to get things done. And I think, just clear communication, constant communication, transparency, don't say anything you don't mean, and mean what you say all the time. I think those are all very, very important things to take into account when we're discussing something like that.
How do you approach something like that in rehearsal? Let's say you think someone is sharp. Do you sugarcoat it, or do you just say like, dude, like, you're sharp? Like, it's tricky, I think.
It is.
Yeah.
And this is like all, it comes up all the time, and I remember it happening in large ensembles. I remember I raised my hand one time in band, and I said something, and the director said, "Well, that was a very diplomatic way of saying that." It was really funny. Because I was just trying to say, I don't know if it's me that's out of tune, blah blah blah, with this other section, or I said something like that, and they're like, "Oh, that was very diplomatic." So I think, just thinking about that brand of diplomacy is something that can help everything run smoothly, and again, keep people's feelings from getting into the mix, people getting emotional about things. So yeah, I think you can also use humor, I think, when it comes to that. But you do have to know people's personalities, so like, if you know that someone is particularly sensitive, maybe someone doesn't have the greatest articulation, let's say, and it's a problem, right? So sometimes you can address something like that more in a one-on-one. If you're really close to that person in the group, let's say, you can address something one-on-one, and have it not be like they feel like they're in interrogation mode or whatever, and getting upset about things. So that's a good way, I think, to deal with it in context. Is just being sensitive again to the situation. People's individual eccentricities definitely play a part in that. So yeah,
for sure. Yeah. Let's move on to talking about balancing chamber music and the H2 Quartet and any other groups you may have with your career, like whether that's solo or teaching. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Luis to start this section.
Sure.
Hey, Dr. Deibel. So I want to know, I'm sure everyone is curious about hearing you say, what is it like to balance an academic job with an active chamber group? And is it difficult to live in different locations?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting because we started off obviously all at the same school, And, you know, back then we were rehearsing like 10 hours a week, and, at some point, people started to move away, people started, I think, I'm not sure who, I think Jeff Leffer might have been the first person to move away, getting the job down in Oklahoma. And then Jonathan, of course, moved to West Michigan. I went down to University of Florida for a while, and Kim was actually at FSU. So we kind of had a little bit of closeness from the end of being both in Florida, me and Kim, and so we used that to our advantage at the time. We scheduled like a tour in Florida that took us through Florida into Louisiana, and I think we hit a couple other schools along the way. And so took advantage of our network within the locations that we found ourselves. And then, with Jonathan still being back up at Michigan, and we all had history in Michigan, we would, the three of us at one point would go back up to Michigan to maybe do some recording at the recording studio up there, and then take a tour like, in Michigan where it was a little bit more convenient. So that's a really good way to minimize costs. We're not rock bands that are going to go on, multi-city tours in all 50 states, that's just not the reality. You can find ways to do things more cheaply like that. But I think it was that year that we were all four in different places that we actually had maybe our most active year in terms of concertizing, like the number of concerts that we gave, because we did proactively schedule some of those tours for ourselves. So we went from that, from all being the same location, all being spread out into 4 different locations, to then all being basically in again, state, which was about 2 hours away from where those guys were in Oklahoma. And the rest of them having moved to Oklahoma. So that afforded us a lot of extra, rehearsal time that we wouldn't have otherwise had. But the reality of it, when you're trying to balance what you do academically in your position, or if you just have a separate job or nonprofit or something like that, everyone's got to come to the table prepared when it's time to rehearse. So we were talking before the session began a little bit about what you guys are doing right now as a group, and I was like now's the time that you've got all this time to yourself, is to learn all your parts for the pieces that you're going to play this year, if there's some new repertoire or brushing up old stuff, and really get those parts down so that when we come back in the fall, fingers crossed, you guys are ready to hit the ground running, and rehearsals will be extremely productive. So it's kind of the case of when we're in school, the same things that are great about being in school also are the things that sometimes keep rehearsals maybe from being as productive as they can. Because, I heard you guys say last week in your meeting that, one person would have to cut a meeting short because they'd have to go to rehearsal, or another person would have to go to class, or, something like that. So there's a little bit of an advantage, I would say, right now in having this alone time, is you can really get those parts nailed down. And that's what we have to do. We have to, make sure that we're ready to go, that when we get together for rehearsal, we can go ahead and rehearse, and we're not learning other people's parts. We know how the piece goes because we listen to recordings. I remember when I was a second year in Kansas, we got into the Concert Artists Guild competition. And I remember being there in New York, and we were, it's hard to find rehearsal space in New York, as you guys know. So, we went to, some music store and rented one of the rehearsal rooms, and we were actually rehearsing material that we were going to record in a couple months, not rehearsing for the competition. We were rehearsing different repertoire because that was the time that we had at the time to do that work. And we were already ready to go for the competition. So, it's like, you got to do the best thing for the group with the time that you have at the time you have, your together time. So that's one.
Absolutely.
I think, of course, there's the element of balancing teaching, with the chamber stuff. And with that, you just have to simply be smart about, what you really have time for. And you have to be ready to maybe say no to some things, or, be honest about, I've got this thing at school that I really have to be there. I've said it many times to the guys in H2, I've really got to make sure that I'm here for this rehearsal, or, this is leading up to, NASA performance. can't be away during that time. So because we've got to get ready or whatever it happens to be. And then you've got to be ready to give up some of your personal time to make up for the time that you're going to be gone, doing your recording or your concertizing or whatever. So you've got to be flexible on your own end of things and be ready to sacrifice some of your time for your students.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Deibel.
Kind of playing off of that. So obviously like H2 is very active, and you also have some duo and trio projects, including some recording stuff. So how do you balance that on top of, this pre-existing group that you have and, everything else?
Yeah. And then, I've got this trio that's going on, my new project that's outside of H2. So it's like, how do you do all that? It's tough. I mean, right now, the four of us are really in fortunate positions because we have full-time, jobs. So that really affords us a lot of flexibility and opportunity. And, if I was working just, regular job, like a retail position or, something else where I had to be like in an office, one of my friends was working for a publishing company for many years and basically building up enough contacts and enough experience to say, okay, now I can quit my job and be a full-time, performing composer. And so far it's, going really well. But, when you're kind of restricted by maybe a position or something like that, or if you're in multiple groups, you have to be careful. You have to make sure that you're not, dumping one thing, to do another. You have to make sure that you're being fair to everybody in the group. So for us right now, it's actually not that big of a problem because we are busy enough and have enough commitments with our own positions that, we're able to, take that weekend to do this one gig or these two gigs at the same time. And we can make those commitments without, letting other things go. And the gigs are, again, it's not like a multi-week, multi-city tour. It's like maybe being gone for a weekend here and there. And, it's pretty easy to balance it out right now for us just because of that flexibility that we have.
How far in advance do you plan for your tours or your weekends away and things like that? Is it like months in advance or a year before?
It really depends on who you're working with. So there's a thing coming up, happening now with all with all the virus stuff, but there's hopefully a big project that's coming up for us in a couple of years with an organization, and that's a multi-year out thing because there's collaboration that's involved with other people, composers and other performers potentially. So sometimes something like that can be a couple of years out. Sometimes we decide, hey, we want to go visit some high schools in this area, for recruiting purposes. We used to do that a lot. We do that. We still do it a little bit. I was supposed to be in Texas in April, which of course didn't happen. And that was something that we started talking about 9 months before, maybe before the school year started. But usually those types of things are a little bit more flexible. And so I'd say like bare minimum would be 9 months to a year. Sometimes you can squeeze in something a little more last minute, like 6 months before. Sometimes you get really lucky. Like, I used to direct the jazz festival in Wichita, and a lot of what we did in booking with that was we would look and see who was already taking big multi-city tours through the area. And a lot of times you can get, groups to come in for a little bit cheaper if they're already going to be, in Kansas City. It's a couple hours down to Wichita, and then you don't have to pay like airline tickets and stuff like that. So sometimes you get lucky and things come together at the last minute, but I'd say a good 9 months is probably standard for making sure that you're scheduling ahead of time.
Definitely.
Do you have any tips for someone planning, like someone like us planning their first tour? Because that's something that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really important things is something I sort of touched on briefly, but it's making sure you get as much bang for your buck as you can in terms of like where you're going to go. So, if Lara's from New Jersey, you're from New Jersey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. From New Jersey, and maybe Beth was from New York or something like that. I know you're not Beth, but that gives you a nice, like, huge chunk of, universities, schools, and potential venues that you could hit in a relatively small, 3 to 4 hour drive radius. You could really hit a lot of places with that. And we used to do that in Texas. We started that when we were in doctoral, when we were doctoral students, because Jeff Leffert, was from Texas, and knew people in Houston, knew people in Dallas, knew people in Austin. The educator network, as you guys know, is pretty tight, and it's a small world. So we were able to hit 8 or 9 different schools within a week sometimes, or maybe a week and a couple days. So knowing what your network is and how to best use it. If people are from states that are next to each other, then that's always a good thing. That's really one good piece of advice. Not having to pay for plane tickets is always a good thing. So, if you guys can do something within the state, or maybe in the Atlanta area. Atlanta is a huge metroplex area that you can hit a lot of places. Cobb County has some of the best high school programs out there. So and maybe a teacher like myself that has contacts up in that area, and I can say, oh yeah, talk to this person. They'll set you up.
What do you recommend because we are sort of in between that, like we're still students, but making developing a professional chamber group? What do you recommend we say in our emails for any groups like us in order to not completely say we're students, so obviously you don't have to pay us? Like coming at it like, well, we do want to get paid and try to make this a professional investment for the group.
Right. That's a little bit of a tricky one. But I would say, first of all, don't present yourselves as anything other than a professional chamber music ensemble, because that's what you are. For us in H2, when we started off, we weren't necessarily maybe thinking of that. I think it wasn't too long before we started to present ourselves more in that fashion. But I mean, you guys are master's and doctoral students, so I mean, you are basically professionals now. It's not just because you're in school doesn't mean that you're anything less than a professional chamber group. So
Right.
present yourselves as anything other than that. And then I would say, you could say we'd normally charge, a $500 fee, but we're flexible and, ready to meet the needs of, or constraints of whatever the program has to offer, or something like that. There's very diplomatic ways that you can put it so that, you know that you are not just giving things away for free, but something that lets them know that you're flexible. I think that's a language that can be worked out, when you make your contacts. And most of us that are in the education world, we definitely want to pay groups. It's just sometimes tough, and there's not a whole lot to go around. So, it's not that people are trying to pull one over on you and get something for nothing. Although that might be appreciated, when you can do things for cheap. But that's also part of being a musician too, is doing a little bit of outreach along with your concertizing. Going into high schools and doing those types of things. So there's nothing wrong with doing a little bit of free outreach here and there.
Absolutely. So being part of many well-established chamber groups, do you find that it has boosted your career as a saxophonist and musician?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely enriched my career quite a bit. I think, anytime that you can have recordings, have maybe a chamber music competition win, or at least being a finalist in a group behind your name, that definitely helps in terms of, if you're applying for academic jobs, just you have a bigger profile, nationally or regionally or sometimes internationally, depending. So yeah, I think it's definitely helpful because it just allows you that, alternative outlet for your creativity and your musicality, and building your profile that way.
Great. Yeah. I know we feel that.
Yeah.
I do.
And it's also something where, how many people are successful soloists, going around playing with orchestras? Like, not that many people, especially for our instruments, So it's just a much easier way um, to concertize and to develop as a concertizing musician, and it also affords, I think, a lot more flexibility. I mean, if you're just one player, and you need an orchestra to back you up, that's not very cost-effective way to do things. It's not very good for logistics. It costs a lot to make that happen. So, that's one reason I think where you've seen the movement a little bit away from major symphony orchestras as the big performing organizations in the world to, more new music ensembles and more modular ensembles, the rise of the reed quintet in your case. These are the growth areas of the so-called classical music world. It's not orchestras. There's not new orchestras popping up most of the time in places. So so we take advantage of that because it's much easier to pull off our act for those reasons.
Yeah, it's exciting to be a part of it.
Yeah.
I think for sure. Amy, you want to take it off about competitions and commissions, CDs?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So what tips, you already alluded to this a little bit, but what tips do you have for groups competing in competitions at a high level such as Fish Off?
Well, we talked a little bit about it, before before we started the session again, of course. So to kind of go back to some of those ideas, I think spending the time doing the fundamental things that a chamber music group has to do to play at a very high level are critical. If you don't do those things and take those steps to get that synergy going with the group, to get the understanding between the players that they need to have to play at a really accomplished and connected level in a live setting, then it's just not going to. I think it's just you're going to sell yourself short and have less success. So when we were doing our 10 hours of rehearsal per week, I think we would spend a good 2-3 hours of that doing tuning exercises or ensemble exercises in the beginning. That might have gone down a little bit as we progressed and played together for longer. But I remember at the time thinking to myself, like, all right, we can all play in tune. Why are we spending this time? But it's not, it's not just learning how to play in tune, but it's learning literally the ensemble qualities of everything. So moving together, knowing, when you see Louis, give a cue, exactly when the note is going to sound, being able to know your part well enough so you can watch over at Bridget's fingers and you see exactly when that note's going to hit. Knowing the tuning tendencies in the high range of the saxophone, right? which are fun. And also the sound density, of course, like knowing the different timbres of all the different instruments. Obviously, that's very important in a case like your guys. The blending aspects of it are critical. So I think what we were talking about again before we started was using this time to learn your parts, and when you get back together, maybe putting a little extra emphasis in the fall, assuming we can hit the ground running in August. Putting some extra emphasis in those first couple of weeks on your intonation, rehearsal strategies, moving together, phrasing together, playing lots of Bach chorales, if you can get arrangements of those. Those are the critical things that I think end up making chamber groups really, really special. Because what you want to do eventually is you want to be able to transcend the score that's in front of you. It's not about, can you play this piece? It's about, what kind of experience can you create on stage for the audience? And, how can you bring the audience into your performance in a way that they forget that they're watching a performance,
Yeah.
Like obviously the judges are going to be doing that, but the crowd is there to be entertained. The crowd is there to be transported. And the extent to which you can do that is defined by how well you can get over those initial humps of just the basic, ensemble things. I really believe that.
Yeah. What role do you think memorizing your music as a chamber group can have in that, and then also just in competing in general?
Yeah, so it's a really good question because, nowadays many of the chamber competitions that I've judged, the groups do memorize, and you see it in Fish Off. You see it everywhere. You've got these groups that are playing entire programs from memory. Do I think that's necessary to give an incredibly compelling performance and move an audience? No, I don't. But I think the reality of some of the competitions nowadays is like you've got all these groups playing at an incredibly high level, and then what do you use to separate them? I was telling a student the other day in one of our meetings is just I have been more favorable to a group that didn't memorize versus one that memorized because the performance was just better. So there are some things that memorizing provides you. It provides you with a little more mobility, in terms of on stage. I have my own particular ideas about what I think is effective in terms of staging and choreography and things like that. Some things I think it's not appropriate. Some things I think it works great. It can get to be a little kitschy, as you guys know. So it's a really tough question. I think if it serves the music, then it's good. If it doesn't do anything for the musical performance, then why bother, I would say. But I think in most cases, it's a really good exercise to do a little bit of memorization. One of the pieces that you guys played, the David Biedermeier piece, kind of requires a little bit of memorization there in the beginning. And I think it's therefore something you have to do, but it's something that does have a little bit of an advantage, in the mobility thing and the choreography thing. But I think it's got to serve the music always.
Cool.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things going back to some of those fundamental exercises that you were talking about. A lot of those are dealing, of course, with like blend and tuning. Did you guys ever do any articulation matching exercises as a group, or do you think that those might be useful?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, articulation is another big one. Whether you're doing, taking a particular passage from a work or just doing, maybe playing scales together with a specific articulation. We all articulate a little bit differently. Fortunately, we're all playing reed instruments. So that makes it a little bit more similar in terms of those qualities of articulation, but there's definitely some limitations with that. And with something we've covered in our coachings together, of course, is, matching those articulations. It can be very, very tricky. But yeah, we definitely did some articulation exercises.
Sorry, not to keep asking 8 million questions. The last thing I find really difficult within a group is to really hear the balance, especially of our different instruments and how they carry to the audience. Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for that, for just getting used to that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's really important. One thing is I would really spend some time playing in different spaces. This is something that with Beth's saxophone quartet we try to do more in the spring semester because my office is a tiny little space that I think is can be dangerous in terms of the way that it sucks up sound and the way the balance is perceived. So your balance can be very much defined by the space that you're in. So I think getting into those different locations, whether it's on a stage, if you have access to a stage, or just a bigger room, a room without carpeting, so maybe a larger rehearsal room, and maybe something that's really dead. I mean, one of the concerts that I'll never forget was I played the Xenakis Quartet at the Xenakis Festival in Athens, but the venue was this. It was like a lecture hall, basically. So it was, completely dead. I was like playing in a closet, a coat closet with all the coats in it. It was the worst. It was the worst thing. And I was like, okay, well, we're just gonna have to be really, really accurate. There's no forgiveness in this room. So I think that that's one big thing. And I would also say the mentality of the players is really important when thinking about balance. So like, we got we did an interview with Van Doren not too long ago about playing in a chamber music ensemble, and one of the things that we were asked was, what do you like? And the first question was like, what do you like about it? And one of my answers was something I have kind of stuck with, which is that everyone in the group is a soloist and an ensemble player at the same time. Doesn't matter if you're, even if you're Bridget playing a whole note, on the bottom of a chord, it doesn't matter. Like you're still playing the soloistic way you should be. And we see this in the reed quintet. I think, Beth being the saxophonist, we normally we assume that the saxophone is going to be too loud. Well, that's not always the case. I often ask for Beth to come out a little bit more in the texture, and I might ask other things that are maybe unexpected in terms of the balance. So I think always being 100% aware of your role within the group, no matter, again, if you're playing a whole note or if you've got some fireworks stuff up on the top or something in between. You got to be aware of that role and actively addressing it in a way that makes sense. And the balance, usually if you have those things in mind, the balance usually takes care of itself. But there are other things that play into balance too, like timbre. So using a different fingering occasionally, or just shaping your sound a little bit differently with your embouchure can make a big difference in how the balance comes across. You can still be present without taking over the sound. Use of vibrato can make a big difference in how balance comes across. So, the voicing of the chords can be very, very problematic sometimes in the writing of pieces. I've played lots of pieces like that where it's just like, man, this is just impossible to get it to sound right. And you have to be pretty creative sometimes when it comes to those things. So occasionally, we've revoiced things. That's a very rare thing that we do, but you can do that sometimes to fix balance.
Yeah. Or I remember one time you suggested, it was for helping the pitch get lower, but I actually use it a lot now to dampen the reed. But when you put your tongue actually like on the reed to dampen the sound, I use it a lot now for balance if I think I'm too loud, and it helps like so much. So
absolutely, yeah. And one of my students who I talked with today is thinking about doing a transcription of a big vocal piece, and so I've been thinking all day long. I've been thinking about manipulation of timbre and the different colors that we can get on our instruments, and thinking about, okay, is this actually possible, or is it possible? So yeah, it's all these things are the thing to remember. I think is all these things are ways that you guys can be creative as an ensemble, right? You can really get some good creativity going when you're addressing these things. There's a way to do it. There's always a way to do it. It might not be entirely pleasant, but it's something that allows you to really flex your creativity, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. Going back to some of the stuff we were talking about a little bit earlier when we were talking about responsibility, one member to sort of in charge of communicating with composers. What is the process?
Can you say that again?
Sorry, did I cut out?
Yeah, just
oh boy. Internet. Okay, sorry, starting over. You talked earlier about one member of the group of H2 working with composers and working to commission different works. What was that process like? And do you have any tips for a group like us that's just starting to sort of dive into that pool?
Yeah, when we started, our first CD was all standard works that we were playing in competitions at the time. And right after we made that, or actually it's probably before we made the recording, because we were probably on to different stuff by then. But by that time, that was about halfway through my doctorate, I think, that we made that first CD. And we were very fortunate to be in a place where we were with a number of really, really good composers who were students at the same institution. And those guys are all still working and writing great music, and kind of spread out around the country now. But at the time, they needed to write for people, and we needed people to write for us. So it was a good opportunity to do some work together, and we got some really great pieces out of it that have gone on to be played, I think, by other ensembles in most cases. So, and they also helped out those composers, because they needed to add to their portfolio. And the saxophone quartet, is a great medium to write in. Wind quintet now might be, a better, or not better, but a newer, it might be the new saxophone quartet, right? So in terms of mediums for those composers to write for. So we ended up, finding a great relationship with those composers who also happened to be our friends. Like, we were hanging out with these people a lot, so they wanted to write for us, and we wanted to play their music. So it worked out great. FSU, I think, is a great place for that. In your guys' case, you've got a really strong composition program. And you even have some, who knows, you might have some composers on the faculty that would be interested in writing for you as well. Because they want their music to be played, and if a group like you is going to continue and, have a career post FSU, then that's good for them because their music, gets to spread out a little bit more and be heard by more people. So we started off doing that, and we continued recording. And so we recorded those works too, which is a really big deal for those composers. A lot of those probably were those composers' first professional recordings. And then that was the Times and Spaces CD, which is our second CD. And we continued, up to the present day, doing new works that are either written for us or maybe written for someone else but haven't been played as much. The CD that we're actually finishing right now is one that has a couple works by a good friend of ours, Takuma Ito, who wrote a piece on that Times and Spaces CD as well. And here we are, 10 years later, and he's got this bassoon quartet that hasn't been played very much. And yeah, Bridget, you should check it out. It's called Sunburnt. And
Definitely, thanks.
he made an arrangement for us for that piece, and it's a really awesome piece, really exciting, and definitely something that audiences like. So other than that, you meet a lot of people in the network by going to conferences. And in terms of just the commissioning thing, I, just as a soloist myself, I've, definitely a couple times I've written composers. So there was a composer that I remember meeting at Darmstadt Festival in 2010, and I was surfing around the internet one day and came across a piece that he wrote for a vocal ensemble called Ekmelis, which is a really fantastic new music vocal ensemble. And his name is Martin Idden. And I'd met him just kind of in passing, and we were out for a beer with a group, but I didn't really, spend that much time talking to him one-on-one. And I just sent him an email. It's like, hey, Martin, I don't know if you remember me. I met you a couple of years ago. I just wanted to say I really, really enjoyed this piece that you wrote for Ekmelis. And I just wondered if he didn't have a website. I don't think he still has a website. But I was like, have you ever written for anything for saxophone? Because I'd really be interested in taking a look at it. And he wrote me back saying, of course, I remember you. And just as luck would have it, I'm planning on writing a series of works for saxophone, and I wonder if you might be interested in maybe premiering them or something like that. So that's led to a couple of commissions, and we did another project last year where I went to England, and we're developing a couple of new pieces right now for saxophone and the talk box, I think it's called. Is it Peter Gabriel used, or somebody else I'm thinking of? Frampton tubes, saxophone and Frampton tubes, where you kind of speak through it and it changes the timbre of the instrument. So kind of a wild project, but it's going to be really interesting, I think. So you never know what happens. When you reach out to composers, there's always possibilities, and that's the way a lot of the commissionings happen too. Is just us reaching out and saying, hey, we really like your music. And as you progress as an ensemble and are able to write grants, maybe getting some of the nonprofit stuff going, then there's opportunities to apply for grants, and we've done that as well with other composers, getting grant money so that these composers can get paid, which is an important thing, obviously.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Deibel, clearly you have some experience with recording CDs. Would you mind sharing some of your, how your process is for recording a CD, and maybe giving some advice for people thinking of doing this process as as beginners?
Absolutely, yeah. So recording is definitely expensive. That's probably the hardest thing about it. It definitely takes money, studio time, editing time, processing. I mean, nowadays, not that many people are actually processing CDs anymore. There's a lot of, digital releases and things like that. So it's a little bit of a different game than it used to be. And I think maybe with our next recording, we might think of either processing a smaller number of CDs or maybe just doing a digital only release. We'll just have to see how it works out. but things are going, or not just going in that way. They're they're there already. So with recording, I think it's a good thing. Maybe the first step would be just to get practice recording yourselves in rehearsals. Because putting yourself, I remember the first time we recorded that first CD, when that red light went on, I felt very differently than I did when I was just playing with the group normally. And it can take a while to get over that mental, hump of just, play, lay it down, don't think of it as being anything different than a normal performance. So I think a good first step is for, groups to just record themselves regularly. That can be obviously a huge help in your rehearsals. And then I think getting ready to make a recording, talk to other groups that have, done recording projects in your area. We happened to get really lucky because there was a recording engineer who was already connected with Michigan State, where we were studying. And, he was a guy that was, at the time just getting started. And now he's got quite a profile in terms of the people that he's recorded. He's recorded some of my colleagues at FSU. Even I didn't even know about it, but he's worked with a lot of people that I'm friends with. And so at the beginning, he was really willing to help us out in terms of doing things a little bit more cheaply. So that's one thing. Finding a good recording engineer is a big part of it. So people whose recordings you really like. You can start there by determining, okay, who can we afford, but who is going to really, really do a good job. And sometimes the people that, do the recording are not maybe the same people that'll do the editing. Sometimes you want different people to do those. We have the same person doing all of our stuff. So it's convenient for us. But when you do the recording, I think also to have someone there who's doing a producer sort of role where they're marking the score in terms of takes. Our recording engineer marks little minuses and pluses next to things that go well and don't go well on different takes. And that makes the editing process a lot faster. And then we all distribute the score afterwards to start putting edits together. We also shift who listens to what pieces. So we will, in the group, let's say we have 7 pieces on a CD. We each do 1, and some of us do 2 pieces for the first edit. We put them together by ourselves and say we want these edits and here, and then we totally flip it and listen to all pieces that we didn't listen to the first time. And that's a good way to share the workload, but also get different sets of ears on the recordings when you're doing the editing process. I'm trying to think what else I could say. Sometimes it makes sense to record things in large chunks. Sometimes it makes sense to record one, full take of something, or a full take of a large section, and then you really want to go into the recording session having a good idea of, okay, I want to break it up between this rehearsal number and this rehearsal number, just do a couple takes of that, and then maybe a couple of other things. Sometimes that you're going to need extra takes of, this one really, really hard thing. So yeah, those are some things that I think can be good to think about when you're going into the studio for the first time.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
What types of grants did you apply for things like CDs?
So we've gotten a couple of the ones that I got first a couple of times were the Aaron Copland Fund recording grants. It's a specific grant that is designated for ensemble recording American. So that's sort of earmarked. You have to spend some time digging through grant databases to find out what's going to be best for your situation. But as it turned out, we were recording a lot of American music by contemporary composers. So that made a lot of sense for us. So we've gotten that a couple of times. There's also Chamber Music America, which you have to be a member of CMA for. There's also New Music USA. We've applied for that a couple of times. I think we've gotten maybe something through them. Yeah, those are the big ones. If you live in New York, or the New York area, and I don't know if this is something that you could take advantage of, Lara, being from there. But a lot of times there's city-specific grants. New York has a ton, as you might imagine. But unfortunately, usually the ensemble has to be operating within New York or working with a New York composer have some connection to the city. But you might find that for things that are more local, you might find city grants or state grants, depending on how supportive the states and local municipalities are for arts projects. So yeah, you really have to do some digging, but those things are out there. You know, they're out there. Just have to find the right ones to apply to, and you really have to. If you're applying for grants, especially if you're a nonprofit, you really have to put the time in and just keep doing it. Applying for grants. I remember numerous people have told me, Claire Chase of the ICE Ensemble, that she applied for 25 grants a year for a number of years before ICE got anything. And then what happens typically is that you start getting one, and then you get another one, and then you get a third, and then other granting. It's kind of a unfortunate thing because there's a lot of great groups out there, but a lot of granting organizations use that indicator of success as how they make decisions. Sometimes it's like, hey, we want to invest in this group because they're already successful. So it's kind of an unfortunate circumstance, but that seems to be kind of how it works.
Absolutely. We are just almost out of time. Is there anything else specific you think you want to share about career, chamber music, teaching, really anything?
I think we're in a obviously really interesting time right now, which is a pretty much a cliche to say at this point, but it does afford some opportunities to try some new things out. Using technology or just getting creative about how you're getting your product out there. But in some way, this is sort of leveled the playing field. We're all on the internet now, and I know that you guys, a couple of you expressed to me like, wow, we were really amazed about how many people like signed on for our live sessions. And I was like, yeah, well, of course. I mean, you guys have a lot to say, and you've got some interesting perspectives, in the position that you're in. So I think what you guys are doing is really great. Just this series in general, but also what you do as a chamber music ensemble. And I like the fact that you are being so proactive on a bunch of different fronts in terms of your commissioning projects, these conversations that happen online, and the other things that you have in the work. So I think those of you that are watching this, I think you can take a lot of example from what Civitasolis is doing, and be really creative about what you do in your own ensembles. I mean, a good saying that I like to go back to is that you make your music where you're at. So just because you're stuck in a smaller town like Tallahassee doesn't mean that you can't be an incredible group and be doing a lot of interesting things. You could be anywhere. You could be in New York, upstate New York, Alaska, whatever. I think isn't John Luther Adams like from Alaska or something like that? That guy's written incredible music. So it just depends on how you use the influences around you to be creative.
Absolutely. And thanks for those of you watching. Dr. Deibel has coached us over the years. So thanks for all the time you have given us as well, helping us to get where we are.
My pleasure. I hope we can get back to it soon.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that concludes our happy hour for today. A reminder that next week we will go live with our call for scores for Reed Quintet miniatures, so be on the lookout for that. And thank you so much, Dr. Deibel, for joining us today. And I hope you all have a great weekend.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.